to help Moroccan women speak out against her country's unfair and obsolete laws. Avni Doshi has a debut novel out. The title is Girl in White Cotton. She is also an art history specialist who has worked as an art writer and curator. Her current focus is fiction and experimental art writing. Howard Jacobson has written 16 novels and 6 works of non-fiction. He has won the Bollinger Everyday Wodehouse Prize for comic writing twice. In 2010, he won the Man Booker Prize for The Finkler Question and was again shortlisted for the prize in 2014 for Jay. And finally, our moderator today, kindly stepping in at the last minute, is Chandrahas Chowdhury, author of Days of My China Dragon, Clouds, and Arzi the Dwarf. He is also the editor of India, a traveler's literary companion. Presented by Dainik Bahaskar, please join me in welcoming to the stage Elizabeth Gilbert, Leila Slimani, Avni Doshi, Howard Jacobson, and Chandrahas Chowdhury.
Howard and I are sitting at opposite ends of this lineup because we've already done an event together, so we're told to stay as far apart as possible.
I'm Howard Jacobson, by the way, just in case there's confusion about.
Okay, a merry crowd, let's get started. The question for today's panel is, where does fiction come from? And in thinking about it, and even for my own work, one very good answer to this question is, I don't know. And sometimes we don't wish to know. As a writer, you don't sometimes want to investigate too closely what you write from. And it's for other people to work that out. And you don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg for your own self. But since we have to talk about this for a while, I'm going to ask, I don't need to reveal anything about my method, but I'm going to ask the 4 of you something about yours. And Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you, partly because you are perhaps the one person in this panel who works in both fiction and non-fiction. And do your non-fiction books come from a different place? And by thinking about that, could you isolate where your own fiction comes from?
I don't think they come from a different place. I think it all comes from the same place. And that place is what I like to call the mothership. And I don't know. I think I don't know is a really good answer for where it comes from. I'm just in obedience to those ideas that for some reason drift in. And sometimes they marinate for a really long time within me. So when I wrote The City of Girls, it was a response to a desire that was about 20 years old in me to write a novel about a promiscuous woman whose life is not destroyed by her sexuality, because that's a difficult book to find. And so it took me about 20 years to kind of let that marinate and saturate until finally it was ready to come. But the bigger question for me is not so much where does it come from, but does this book want to be a novel, or does this book want to be nonfiction? And I truly don't know how to answer arriving at that, other than you just have to taste your way into it somehow. It's very intuitive.
Could Eat, Pray, Love have been a novel since on that line?
I don't think so. That one was pretty clearly needed to be a memoir, I think. That's probably the only one I've ever written that was pretty demanding about what it wanted to be. So yeah, I don't think it would have worked as a novel.
Leila, I'm going to ask you, when you wrote The Perfect Nanny, one takes something from an incident in real life and then writes it up as a novel, but what you have to find all the time as a fiction writer is a certain style and a tone that's just right for the book. And what do you have to do to get that? And when did you get that in that book?
You have to work. The first time I began to work about the Perfect Nanny, I was just wanting to write a book about a nanny, the sort of a portrait of a nanny. And I wrote the first version of this book, and the nanny was an African woman living in Paris, and she was having a lot of problems like many immigrants are having in Paris, but it was not working. And after like maybe 100 pages or 150 pages, I found the book very, very boring. And even myself, I didn't want to read this book. And I was wondering, how can I make it interesting? Because, you know, the life of a nanny is very uninteresting because you do it's very repetitive. Every day you do the same thing. You make food for the children and you go to the park, and the diapers and the puree and the cryings. It's every day the same. So I decided that she was going to kill the children, so it's more entertaining.
It's good what you say, and I think it's important for sometimes when people are curious about their writing life, it's important to know that writers are very often bored by their own work, and that's a sign that your instinct as a reader is kicking in, and when you're bored with your own work, that's an incentive to work out what is the right answer, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when you write a novel, what you want is people to turn pages, and yourself, you want to every day to wake up and to want to continue to be interested in your own characters. You live with them all the time, 12 hours per day. You're obsessed with them. So if you're obsessed by someone who is boring and has a boring life, the novel is not going to be that interesting. So yeah, you have to find the clue, you have to find the thing that will make the novel interesting and the narration interesting.
And do you keep that for books down the line, or do you have to find that again when you write another book?
No, you have to find that again, yeah, of course.
Avni, I'm going to come to you, and your first book just came out, and one is always asked as a debut writer how long it took to write something. And there is, even in fiction, as in so many other things, something like the 80-20 rule, where you spend a lot of your time not doing something very successfully, and then because you have failed at all those levels, you suddenly, the writing clarifies itself and you know where to go. So in a way, the answer to where a book comes from could be, potentially, it comes from itself, isn't it? When you write many iterations of something, you finally work out what is its best self.
Yeah, I mean, my book definitely came from failing. I was proficient at failing. I failed every day, and I talked about it a lot, about how every draft was rubbish, and it took me a very long time, as you said. It was 8 drafts, over the course of 7 years to write this book. So definitely, I would say that the book came from itself. But I also think, you know, we're always absorbing things, we're seeing things, we're hearing things, and I kind of think that in the unconscious somewhere there's like this magical compost heap where things and ideas are fermenting and words and phrases are fermenting, and I like to sometimes think I'm accessing that in some way when I'm writing.
Howard, I'm going to come to you, and in talking about how you began as a writer, you've spoken a lot about wanting to be a novelist for many years before actually becoming one. And when we were talking yesterday, you spoke about how you would go home in your 30s to meet your parents, and your father would sidle up to you and say, "Have you gotten started yet?" And it was a joke for him. And is it useful as a writer? Is it a burden, or is it a source of creativity to have had a very long literary education and a life in literature before one becomes a writer?
I don't know. It all depends on whether what one's written is any good or not. If what I've written is any good, then it was a big advantage to me to have a long literary education. But my literary education lasted so long, I was a student and then I was a teacher of literature, that my magic compost heap was bigger than your magic compost heap. My compost heap was enormous, and my sense of failure. You said you wrote 7 drafts. I was too much of a failure even to write a draft. Even to just be able to do a draft would seem to me to have been a success. I wrote out of sheer desperation in the end. But that's not, I don't think the novel came out of desperation. I think the novel comes out of, well, it comes out of desperation in this sense, that you should finally abandon any idea of who you are and your ambitions to be a particular kind of writer. And in my experience, you only start writing when you don't know what you're doing and you don't recognize who you are. So suddenly it is like a miracle, and the other word for compost heap is God. And sometimes you do feel that God must be working through you because things happen that you don't recognize. And at the end of a good day's writing, you think, where did any of this come from? Look at these fantastic ideas. I never had that idea in my life. Look at these, I don't know these characters. When you know the characters, when you recognize the ideas, that's when you're writing rubbish. And that's, I think, the great defense of the novel, is it comes from somebody you don't recognize, and you hope it will go, that the reader too will read and think, I don't know who I am now. When readers say, I love this book because it's me, this is me, that's no good. You should read a book and go, I don't recognize myself, and if I do recognize myself, I don't like myself, I am now somebody else entirely. And if we, the novelists, are somebody else entirely, and you, the readers, are somebody else entirely, it's miraculous, it's wonderful, and that's the reason we do it all.
We've spoken a bit already about looking at your own work and thinking it's not good enough. Is it even more dangerous when you feel when you're writing that this is really wonderful and that it's been a great success, the day has been a great success?
Well, I've just spoken, but I will say one thing. One or two people are not well today who were going to be on this panel. And another person who was going to be on this panel walked past me as I was coming here, and I said, how are you? And he said, stand away, I've just been projectile vomiting. I thought I'd pass that on to you as something. And I'm talking about, given what you're saying, a good day, a writing in which you've written a lot of words, and that for me would say 1,000 words at the end of a day. At the end of a day, when I've written a lot like that, I feel I've projectile vomited. It makes me feel shocking and I go to bed thinking, I've got to get rid of those words. I've got to get up early in the morning and remove those words, because otherwise I might die and people will see this rubbish as my final words on earth. I think the good days are when you write almost nothing. A really good day is when you write almost nothing. So it's a slow process.
I almost don't have any more questions to ask. I'm going to think of some. Elizabeth, I've always felt when you look back at your own life as a writer and you think, what made you write the things you did? Fiction comes half from life and half from literature, I think. And sometimes it takes the example of another writer for you to tell yourself, this is what I want to do in my writing. And there's, for each one of us, some novel, some group of novels, or some writer to whom we look at as a personal talisman. And I'm wondering if for you and for all of you on this panel, there is some work of fiction, possibly not very well known to anyone in this audience, that for you stands as a kind of gold star in the realm of fiction, for something that brought you to an awareness of the possibilities of the form itself. Shall we start with you?
Yeah, for me, that's a very easy answer. The foundational literature of my life were the series of books written by L. Frank Baum called The Wizard of Oz, collectively. My sister and I were the only children, grew up on a small family farm in the middle of nowhere, no neighbors, no media, no television, but we had those books. We had actually my grandmother's editions of those books from the 1920s, beautifully illustrated with Art Deco illustrations, starring a young farm girl,
yes,
who I identified with completely because she was bored out of her mind, so as was I. So starring a bored, adventurous young farm girl who gets to escape into a world of color from a world of black and white, and have extraordinary adventures. Also, very interestingly, I didn't find this out till years later, but It's one of the first books that you could say, if you talk about the hero's journey, the arc of the hero's journey, one of the first very popular books that start a girl in that position. And that is not accidental, because L. Frank Baum's, both his wife and his mother were really prominent suffragettes.
Yes.
And his wife was the head of the Kansas Suffragette Society, bringing the vote to Midwestern women. And so he had a very strong sense that these adventure stories needed to star girls. And my sister and I read those books until they fell apart. And then we acted them out until they fell apart. And then we rewrote them. And we both ended up becoming writers. She's a children's writer, and I write for grown-up children. But both of us decided to devote our entire lives to creating imaginary worlds that are better and more interesting than the real one.
Leila, you next?
To be really honest, of course, I was a reader when I was young. But if I wanted to be a writer, it was more because I was an admirer of the life of writers. You know, I used to read about Baudelaire and Dostoevsky and all those men who had so much passions and were drug addicts, and they drank so much, and they traveled all over the world, and they were bad people and scandalous and impolite. And I wanted to be like them, you know, because
Literature gives you the license to misbehave.
Yeah, and I had no skills when it comes to guitar, so I couldn't be a rock star. So, and I was like, maybe I can be a rock star in literature. So that's what I wanted, to be impolite and to be rude and to travel all over the world with a lot of lovers. That was my goal.
Do you find all that has worked out?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Good for you. Let's have a chat later. Avni, you next.
I would have to say I was 16 probably. I was in the 10th grade, and I came across Lolita for the first time, and I was completely like shocked and taken by that book. I had never read or heard of anything like this. I had never read sentences like his, and I remember my teacher at the time gave us all a project to write a story or write something creative based on a novel that really inspired us. And so I started to write a play based on Lolita. And I remember I got to the point where I was so uncomfortable by my own writing. I was so uncomfortable by what I was putting on the page. The entire story about this older man and this young girl, that I put it aside, and I told the teacher, you know, I can't do this. And I still remember he was so wise, he wouldn't let me. He said, no, he said, the fact that it's making you this uncomfortable means you've hit on something true, and you've hit on something that you need to explore. This will really help you expand. And he was right, and I still kind of use that as a measure when I'm writing. If something makes me uncomfortable, if I feel like I don't want to go there, I know, you know, that that's really where I need to go.
Howard, we're waiting for you.
Yes, that's good. I'm going to be such a disappointment to you. I'd love now to say that I aspired to a sex-crazed, drug-mad life of a writer, and that indeed I lived that kind of life and wrote those kind of books. I'd love to be able to tell you that. But the book that had the profoundest impression on me when I was Jane Eyre. There was no drugs, there was no alcohol. It was written by an English, rather severe spinster woman in very, very, very elegant but austere prose, and it was the story of a shy little girl. And in that shy little girl, no sex, no drugs, I found myself. And in that shy little, that's who you see before you at the moment, a shy little girl. So all the sex is going to come from over here. And I'm going to talk to you about introversion, quietude, shyness, wanting to join a convent, maybe. But whenever I hear people saying, there weren't the right kind of books for me when I was growing up. There were only books about men or something or other. You sometimes hear people of one gender or another complaining that the books they read were of the wrong gender. When I read about Jane Eyre, I never thought about gender. I didn't think, this is a little girl and I'm a boy, there's something wrong here. I just thought the writing was so wonderful. I was in the life of somebody who was suffering. I was in the life of somebody for whom every day really was an agony. And I just assumed every day was an agony for everybody, really. That's what life is. Every day is an agony. And every day of childhood, is it not an agony? Or am I peculiar here?
I agree completely.
Every day.
I agree.
And the great introverted 19th century novels tell that story, the sheer pain of being a human. And it doesn't matter if you're white, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish, it doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl. If a writer can give you that, a writer gives you the whole experience of what it is to be human. So I'm sorry to be a disappointment to you, but that's that.
There's a shy little girl in every man. That's what we learned now.
Yes, let's talk about that sometime. Some kinds of literary forms call for inspiration and speed. Some others, and the novel is such a form, ask for stamina and slowness. And you want the book finally to look like it was written itself out, but that's not how it is. It takes years, months, weeks of steady work in order to aggregate words so that it becomes a novel. I want to ask all of you, how much of your writing is actually done at your desk, and do you need to know when you reach your desk in the morning where you're going to go?
I would say, like Howard, that when I write, I'm in the dark. I'm completely in the dark. I have the feeling that I'm blind and I'm trying to find my way, but I don't try to understand what I do. I don't try to convey a message. I don't try to explain something to my future readers. I just have something to say, I don't know what it is, and I say it or I write it. And I really believe in what Marguerite Duras, the French writer, used to say about writing. She says, it's the writing that writes. C'est l'écriture qui écrit. The more you write, and the more you write, something happens that you can't explain. There is like sort of magic, and that's exactly what happens with characters too. There's a story I love very much about Tolstoy when he was writing Anna Karenina. He took a lot of time to write Anna Karenina, and his publisher gave him a large amount of money before he gave the manuscript. And one day, the publisher was really angry against Tolstoy, so he decided to take the train and go to Tolstoy's house. And he asked him, now you have to give me the manuscript or you give me back the money. And Tolstoy looked at him and he said, but Anna Karenina left and I'm waiting for her. And the publisher thought that he was making fun of him, but sometimes it's just that. You're living with a character and he's living in you, and you don't really... People ask you sometimes about the psychology of the characters, and you want to say, I don't know. It's just that I've lived with him for hours, for weeks, for months, for years, but it doesn't mean that I know him. It's just that I belong to him and he belongs to me. So it's something quite magical, but we are in the dark.
I would have to agree with that. I think I don't really know what I'm going to write or what I'm going to say until I arrive at the page, and then it really happens sentence by sentence. Zadie Smith has an amazing essay on craft where she says all writers are either macro planners or they work at a micro level. And I think I tried for a long time to work at a very macro level and plan and plot, and I had walls covered in index cards and just, you know, it was all there on the wall, and I just had to get it down on the page, and that never worked. I always found by the time I got to the page, the story was dead. And it was just, you know, I felt, what's the point of telling it now? Because it already feels spent. And I found that when I write sentence by sentence by sentence, and I just kind of follow a sensibility, a mood, and if I'm as surprised as my characters are when something happens, then I know that it feels alive and it feels good to me.
I'm definitely a macro planner. So I'm glad we have the diversity so that any aspiring or struggling
Yes.
writers out there can see that there's not one way to do this. But definitely for me, I spend years preparing to write my novels. They're very heavily researched. I've got shoe boxes filled with index cards, separated by character, by scene. I mean, it's really like a infrastructure, massive project. And for me, the vast majority of the work is done before I even sit down to write. And so much groundwork has to be laid so that I feel that I have everything I could possibly need. And I also really love that process, I have to say. I enjoy, and the book comes to me through the research. So I'll be in the library for hours and hours a day and then getting ideas for characters from things that I'm reading. And then my favorite thing is that what I try to do is I try to make my job as easy as possible when it comes to time to sitting
Yes.
down to write, because it's hard enough.
Yes.
And so I feel like I'm my own research assistant. And the best and most loving thing that I can do for myself is to prepare myself as well as I can so that when I'm actually sitting at my desk every morning, I've got what I need. And so there are really fun moments where I'll be doing, like when I was doing research for The Signature of All Things, and I was reading about missionaries going to the South Pacific in the 18th century, and I would find these amazing, really fantastic, explicit little details, and I would write them down on the index card that went in the missionaries in Tahiti department of my shoebox. And I would drop this fantastic little detail into the box, and I would literally grin. I would be in a library and I would think, future Liz is going to be so happy when she finds this 2 years from now. Because I knew it would be years before I actually sat down to write. And I would send this little nod through time to my future self, being like, I got you so hooked up. You are going to be so happy when you find this card. And indeed, I would be sitting there 2 years later writing. I would open up that little section, find that piece of information, and I'd be like, thanks, past Liz. You're welcome, future Liz. It's like this little dialogue between your past self and your future self so that you can remove as much of the suffering as possible. That said, there's only so much you can plan, and the characters still take me by surprise, but the more prepared I am for it, the less suffering I have to do.
But don't you love to suffer?
I'm not French.
No.
I'm American. I'm going to outplan suffering. No,
You've just given me a terrific idea for a new novel. It's called The Shoebox. And it's the tragic story of someone who decides, he listens to a great writer and he thinks, that's the way. He's never produced anything yet, and he thinks the reason he's never produced anything is he hasn't got a shoebox. So he goes out to buy some very expensive shoes. Will it be men's shoes or will it be women's shoes? Already there's a gender issue here. I'm not going to tell you what he's decided yet because I haven't made my mind up. It's a very expensive pair of shoes. Brings the shoes, maybe something, there'll be a subplot with the shoes. Maybe he'll give the shoes to a woman or to a man with whom he will fall in love. That might happen. But the main thing is he has an empty shoebox by his desk and cannot find anything to put into the shoebox.
It is
The
so
days
unfair
go-
that you just came
the
up with
days
such a
go
good
by.
novel
You-
idea
well, you
like
want-
that.
You want the story back? All right, you can have it. But it's very sad. You can have it and you can put the shoebox idea in your shoebox. And the years go by and nothing ever gets in the shoebox. And finally, he's living a lonely life, and finally people come to his room and find that he's shriveled to nothing. And there's nothing written on the typewriter, and there's just a few bones in the shoebox, and it's his bone. Now, I can tell already from your response, this is a wildly successful.
Very good.
It's called The Shoebox. Various publishers will fight, so I can't tell you who'll be publishing it. But I'll be here next year to sign it. It'll only be a thin volume of The Shoebox.
I'll take a 15% commission on that, Howard.
You'll certainly get a major acknowledgement.
Major acknowledgement.
I'm on-
We should be demanding 2% each of royalties.
Acknowledgement's enough. How many do you think I'm going to sell of these? But I agree with, I'm not on your side, I'm on your side. I don't know what's going to happen in the morning. I love love not knowing what's going to happen in the morning. And I love that sense of I talk about lowering myself. I often talk about kind of going into a dark tunnel and not knowing if I'm ever going to come out of the tunnel. But that's not quite right. It's like lowering myself. You lower yourself into language. It doesn't matter which language you're working in. The language in which you are working, and you can't write unless you work in language, the language in which you work is that all language is a history of everything that's been thought and everything that's been written in that language. So you work in your language and you've not been able to talk about what you do already without mentioning great French writers. I feel the same. I go to my desk and I'm speaking the language, we said this the other day, I am speaking the language of Shakespeare and Dickens. In other words, I am keeping company with Shakespeare and Dickens. I'm not as good as them. I might be frustrated every minute of writing that I can't do what they did, but we're in the same medium. And that's a terrific responsibility, and it's also a terrific privilege. And it explains the way as a writer, you're never just you. It's never just yourself. You cannot be only an egoist in writing because language is not you. It doesn't belong to you. You might have a share of it, but it's somebody else's. So that immediately you start writing in a language, the things that you're writing is both public with an old history, and it's you and private to you. And that meeting of the private you and the public language is the most exciting thing about writing for me.
Taking up that thought, one might say that a novel is an artifact of language which speaks many tongues. And inside the world of the novel, there is the organizing voice of the narrator who describes everybody. There's also lots of people speaking slightly different languages from each other and sometimes talking past each other. I want to ask you some things about the writing of dialogue. How important is this skill to you within the world, within all the techniques of writing fiction? And what is the relationship, in your view, between real speech and speech inside a novel? Are they just analogues of each other, or is talk inside the book very different in a way? It just sounds naturalistic. Howard, come on, we've never seen you silent for a long time.
I don't like anything to be dead real. I don't like anybody to be absolutely like an actual human being is.
Yes.
And I don't like the words that they speak to be the actual words that people speak. Sometimes I hear something on a bus or something, and I think that will go really, really well on the page, and it never does, and it shouldn't. It should always, everything should be ever so slightly elevated. We are doing something grand when we are writing. We're not doing something every day. If you do something too grand, it's preposterous. So you always have to get that little balance right. But you have to feel I owe it to a reader that when they open a book of mine, they're not just going to read what they could have heard on the bus that morning. When you read The Shoebox next year, I promise you that people will not just talk about a shoebox as though it's a shoebox. It's a magic shoebox. The word magic has been used several times, and it's very, very important. It's magic because we don't know where it comes from, but it should be magical too, in which I don't know whether you know him. There was a great Australian writer called Henry James. It's called Clive James. There is a great Anglo-American writer called Henry James, but I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about Clive James, an Australian writer who died recently. And he said a wonderful, wonderful thing about language, about what writing is like. He said he writes a sentence, and then people said, what makes a good sentence, or what makes good dialogue? And he says, you write the sentence, and then you hold it up and wait for the light to catch it. And if the light catches those words are then illuminated and become alive. Ordinary daily speech is speech without the light catching it. We all know this, don't we? That moment when we feel something sulfuric has happened to the words that we're using. And it's that means we have an obligation to be more than just realists. We are none of us just realists.
For me, it has always been very difficult to write dialogues exactly for this reason. And I remember that when I gave my first manuscript to my publisher, he made fun of me because in the dialogues I tried to imitate what I heard in the bus, because I thought that if I wanted it to be real, I had to imitate. And he said to me, no, you're writing a novel. People are not speaking like that in a novel. You're trying to do the best you can with language. And it has just to be authentic, to be sincere for you as a writer, but you don't imitate what you hear. So that's something I learned from my publisher. But I would say, concerning the bus, that at the same time, when I write, I hear everything. And sometimes in the bus, you can hear people and you can hear just a sentence that is so poetic and so beautiful and so relevant when it comes to your own novel. Because when you're writing a novel, everything is relevant, or you hear things in a very accurate way. So sometimes in the street or from my child, I can hear a sentence that is so beautiful and so poetic, and I will reuse it. But I totally agree with him. The point of a dialogue is not to imitate what we hear in real life. We're not writers of TV shows, but of literature.
I was just going to say, for me, it's the most fun part of the writing is the dialogue. I delight in it. And I have to be careful not to have books that are just nothing but 75-page conversations, because that is very fun for me. I think that for me, the prose is kind of, it's very architectural and it's very formal. It's like the prose is sort of orchestrated and the dialogue is jazz. So it's where the soloist gets to step forward into the spotlight. And that's really where my characters do take a life of their own, is when I let them speak. But then I have to pull them back in and make sure that they haven't just completely taken over the entire book. We've got to keep the plot on track. So yeah, I love it. I enjoy it immensely.
I don't love it much. I think I do read, I always try to read my dialogue out loud, much like I do all of my prose. But, and just try to hear how it sounds. Does it kind of roll off the tongue, or am I getting stuck in places? I've noticed what's really helpful for me personally, and this is maybe more of a practical thing when I'm writing dialogue, is to pare things down a little bit, to leave a little bit of space for subtext, to leave a little place for mystery. I find when I begin to write dialogue, the kind of first time I write it, I'm saying too much. I'm over-explaining, and I think for me, at least, that's like a big tendency. And I think dialogue can be fun, tangential things can be brought in, but it's something I have to be very careful with, because I can really make a mess of it. So yeah, I would say paring it down helps.
I like it. I like dialogue too for what it does to the look of a book. If I were looking for a book to read, I'm too old now to go into a bookshop and look for a book to read. Either, if it's any good, I will already have read it, or I will already have written it, or it will be written by somebody too young for me to bear reading, because either they will be so good it's too upsetting, or they're not good enough and I think, what's all the fuss about? So I stay away from bookshops. But were I to go into a bookshop and open a book to choose, if I see a book without dialogue in it, I don't want to read it. I don't like the airlessness. It's as though dialogue gives a novel air. It's partly the spacing around. I'm not very good at those. You know, there are some novels around at the moment. There always have been some that are just one sentence. I mean, it's brilliant to write a novel 9,000 pages of just one sentence. That's brilliant. But I like to see punctuation. Punctuation is like the novel breathing. Yes. And dialogue is the novel breathing as well. And so I plead with you. I mean, I don't know what your novel kind of looks like physically.
There's a lot of white space.
As long as there's a lot of white space, that's all right. If it's not dialogue, though, what's creating the white space?
It's more, I think, fragment.
Okay. As long as that. Don't you think white space you need a bit? Are you a white space writer? Yeah. You a white space writer?
I think it comes even when you're a kid. You look at books and you think, when you're learning how to read, you think, you get to a page that's all dialogue and you think, oh, I can get through this.
Yes. Yes.
When you're little and you're just learning how to read those chapter books.
Yes.
I think it's a hangover from that.
I'm worried that you're shaking your head. Do you do French dance?
Yes, I do. And Oriental dance also.
Yes.
All kind of dance.
But the great... But Flaubert has got lots of dialogue and space.
Yeah, and I think
Flaubert
that
breathes.
the great novelists of the 19th century in France, Balzac or Maupassant, they write wonderful dialogues, and they give air because it was the feuilleton in newspapers, so they needed to give air to the novels, and the dialogues are wonderful. In Flaubert, the dialogues are so funny
Yes.
and so clever. Yeah, of course.
Let's get to something smaller, words. What would you say, sometimes we're not aware of how exactly we write. What is the word that you tend to overuse the most in your writing, which you cut out later when you see it all together?
I have a story. My first
Please,
book,
yes.
when it was published, I still have a list. Her name was Mrs. Frances Apt, and she was the lifelong copy editor at Houghton Mifflin in Boston. She was a former school teacher and a rigorous grammar Nazi, and my first book was one of the last books she ever worked on, and that was 20 years ago, and she was in her 90s at the time. And I still have a list that I keep on my bulletin board of Mrs. Frances App's forbidden words for me, because she gave me a list and said, these are the words that you have to really watch out for. You use them a lot. Actually, just, lovely, really. She did this whole thing, and very is a word that I use often, and because I don't trust the sentence, so I need it to be very powerful, very beautiful, very, very, very. And I still have, I actually framed it for a while because I loved it, but one of her edits on one of my manuscript pages of my first book, she had found 4 veries on one page, and she had circled them and said, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one. And then when the page turned, the very first word at the top of the page was very. It said very soon after. And she circled it and she wrote, now I'm begging you to stop, which is probably my favorite edit that I've ever gotten in my entire life. And this is why we need editors, because we can't see it. We have blind spots in these ways. We are very, very blind.
Lovely. How are you looking at me very skeptically, as if you never cut any words out of your manuscripts?
No, I'm trying to think. I mean, I think I probably use the word Jew too often. But I could justify that.
Yes.
Failing that, I think turbulent. And I use it when I'm feeling my job is to be, as a writer, turbulent, to upset you all, to make everybody uncomfortable. And I would only use the word clearly, unconsciously, when I feel I've not done that. So if I haven't written a turbulent chapter, the word turbulence starts to appear all over. My wife is very good at that, and she puts a pencil through, because my wife is the first person that sees my manuscript, and the manuscript comes back. She leaves the word Jew alone, mainly, but the word turbulent has a line through it, which creates a very turbulent atmosphere in the house, I could tell.
I think probably, I don't know, my editor's in the front, but he's avoiding eye contact with me. So anyway, I think maybe I use the phrase in particular a lot, and I have to cross that out because it's kind of meaningless in most sentences. And I've noticed I describe everyone's teeth a lot. And I think maybe I just notice teeth all the time. Like I'm just always looking at people's teeth when I'm talking. I don't know.
Everyone's keeping their mouth very shut now.
No. So yeah, I've noticed I maybe over-describe. There's too many descriptions of teeth that I have had to take out.
I really don't know. Some people would say that I talk a lot about sex, and that it's a lot about that. And my translator in English, Sam Taylor, when he began to translate my book, Adele, he was very embarrassed. So he called me and he said, we have a problem, because in French you can use the word le sexe to qualify genitals. And he said in English you can't. So we will have to speak a lot about penis and vagina and vulva for like months together. So let's get friends, because I feel very embarrassed to speak of that with you. So yeah, if you speak with my English translator, I would say that I speak a lot about sex and a lot about shame. The word shame is very, very present in all my books. And my publisher in France, he said to me that I speak too much about that. And I think that has to do with my Moroccan education, where use this word a lot, hshuma, in Arabic. And when you say to someone that he has to be polite, you say you should be ashamed. So the word shame is a lot in my book, and I try to avoid it a little bit now. So shame and sex, which is weird, but...
Can I change my mind? My word's shame too. I'm not copying you. I now realize I use the word shame more than I use the word... what was the word that
Turbulent.
Turbulent, yeah. I don't think I've ever used the word turbulent, come to think. But shame is on every page. And I'm feeling shame now as you talk about those sexual parts, because as a reader of Jane Eyre, you don't read about any of them.
Girl, of course.
I could ask a lot more questions because this is turning out to be on this very nice fireside chats, but I think it's time to invite everybody else to this occasion. And you've warmed them up very nicely. Can we get some questions from the audience? Yes, how about you, ma'am? Waving the JLF schedule right in the front.
You know, while listening, a question cropped up in my mind. There is a general concern nowadays that children or even young adults, they don't read anymore. Everybody says that, oh, children are not reading because there are other avenues. There's the internet or the TV. Now, if children or adults, they are not reading, how are the books selling? Because every other day we hear of bestsellers being made everywhere. Now, if your topic was on how fiction is made, my question is how fiction is sold.
These are very disturbing thoughts.
It isn't.
You know, I think that if you want, people ask me all the time, how can I do for my children to read? And I usually answer, read yourself. If you read in front of your children, they will read. For my children, it is very natural to read, because when they wake up in the morning, mommy is reading and daddy is reading and we are all reading. So for them, it's natural to read.
I hope you don't read them your books.
No, no, but my son stole my book and he said, I know who you are.
Okay, let's go to someone at the back and then we'll come out front again. How about you right there at the back, holding your pen up?
Thank you. So this question comes from a more from a personal inhibition of mine, which is before writing your first book, which respectively everyone would have had different processes. Did you ever believe that you don't nearly know enough to write a book, or you haven't read enough to write a book? And if you did believe so, how did you really navigate around that? Because personally, I'm not able to navigate around that, and I'm not able to write at all for this fear specifically.
Did you ever believe you were not good enough to write a book?
Did you want to answer that? No. There's a wonderful, I don't know if you all know Ira Glass. He's an American radio producer, and he has a beautiful, simple statement about this exact problem, because most people become writers because they were readers. And so what happens is that from a very early age, if you're a reader and you're passionate about literature, you develop extremely good taste. So you know the difference between what good writing is and what bad writing is. And then you want to become a writer. And the problem is you have good taste, but you don't have good skills. And so immediately there's this massive canyon of a gulf between what you know is good and what you're capable of actually doing. And that gulf, that canyon, can be where most people meet their death as writers, because they don't have the patience or the mercy toward themselves to bridge that. And it takes quite many years, and you have to do a lot of very bad writing before you can actually begin to narrow the gap between what you're capable of doing and what you know is good. And so there has to be, I think, the more than discipline and more than rigor, I think the word that's needed here is mercy, is self-forgiveness, to be able to endure how long it takes to be able to actually develop a craft. And so that would be my wish for you, is that you have patience with yourself to make that journey.
Can I just add one thing? Every single writer suffers from the kind of imposter syndrome that you speak of. Every single writer. I think you can ask someone who's written 10 books, a person who writes a book a year, a bestseller. You can ask all of them. Every time they come to the page, they are beginning again. And just because you've written a good book in the past, it doesn't mean you'll ever write a good book again. And so I think what you're speaking of, it's actually deeply natural, and it's something that everyone experiences. I would say all of us up here, I'm answering for everyone. I think everyone up here suffers from
Absolutely. It's like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, you take a rock and you put it on the top of the mountain and you have to redo it again. And at the end of a novel, you ask yourself, how did I do that? You don't know, and you don't learn from, I don't learn from writing. I have the feeling that I'm beginning all over again. But at the same time, that's what is exciting. And I would say to you, don't compare yourself. You know, at the beginning, I was like, what's the point of being a writer when you have read Proust or Dickens or Tolstoy? I will never be this kind of writer, of course, but I love them so much, and I love to read so much, and I love to write, even if I love to suffer. I love to write you. I love this excitement. I love this vertigo, and I love the fact that I don't understand what I do.
Can I just say one thing to that person? It's a question, really. Are you unhappy? Are you unhappy enough yet to be a writer? Because unless you're deeply, deeply unhappy, you're wasting your time, I think.
Let's have a question for the person with the greatest possible age gap from Howard. Oh, there's someone right up here.
I wanted to ask, where do you get your best ideas from?
Best ideas from?
I steal mine from Elizabeth.
As you've seen, it's the last time I'm ever talking to Howard Jacobson.
I get mine from dreams. I think dreaming is really good.
Yes.
Dreaming is great.
I get mine from Paris, walking in the street. I walk a lot, and writers are thieves and liars. That's what's good. You know, as a child, you don't have the right to lie or to steal. But as a writer, you can steal and you can lie. And that's what I like about it. So if you want to lie and to steal, come and become a writer.
I get my ideas from listening to people tell stories about their lives. So stealing, absolutely.
Very good. You, ma'am, you've been waiting a long time.
Hi, thank you. That was a great session. What I want to know is, as writers, sometimes you have some kind of a movie playing in your head that this is what I'm going to write. But when you sit down to write it, you completely, you don't know how to put it on paper. So has that happened with you? And you talked about, the ideas marinating for a long time. So what is that process that when you have that movie perfect in your head, and then it's not about the writing skill, but you are not knowing where to start, how to put it on paper?
It's a good question. Where do you start a story?
When do you start it? Where? There's so much mysticism in it, and I have listened to everybody on this stage talk enough to know that we all are involved deeply in mysticism and in magic. There's a certain amount of this that simply cannot be controlled and cannot be explained. And the best way that I can say it, my personal sort of spiritual beliefs around writing, and the only way that I've been able to write book after book after book, is my own magical thinking. And my own magical thinking says, this book wants to exist, and it has chosen me. And it's not trying to be an obstacle. It actually longs to exist. And it's come to me for a reason, because it thinks I can do it. And so it's a relationship between me and the book itself. And it's a great deal of very, very instructive listening, where I'm listening to the story. And every morning when I wake up and I'm working on a novel, I will literally ask my characters, show me how I can help you. Show me what it is that you want people to know about you. I'm here to serve you. I'm here to serve this book, right? And so the reverence that I have for the work means that I try to clear out as many obstacles from my personal life so that I can hear better. So that can mean things like not drinking all night and actually getting some rest so that my mind is clear so that I can hear better. Getting up early before the world is calling me and texting me and emailing me so that I can hear better. It's a deep relationship of reverent listening. And the book itself, I truly believe, will tell you, it will guide you to show you where it wants to be, and it might have nothing to do with what you planned, no matter how many shoeboxes you created, right? The shoeboxes are a way that I get my courage up to actually sit down and feel like I'm prepared enough. But in the end, I really really believe that ideas come to us because they want to be made manifest. They're looking for a human collaborator. If they've chosen you, it's a great honor, and I come to it with a lot of reverence and a lot of silence so that I can hear the direction that it wants to go in more than the direction that I want to drive it in.
Who's next? Someone at the back. How about you, sir, in the blue? Yes, right there.
Hi, my question is to any of you. You've started writing a novel, and then in the middle somewhere you abandon it. Has that ever happened, and what have you done about it? Are you planning to come back to it, or have you come back to it?
Yes, of course it happens. For me, it happened 2 or 3 times. One time I understood months after that it was not a novel, that it was a play, that the problem was a problem of form, that I didn't understand that the story was good, but it was not meant to be a novel. So I decided to make a play instead, and it worked very well as a play. So sometimes it's just that you're not in the good place. The story is good, but you're not in a good place, and sometimes it's just not good. Sometimes you, as you said before, sometimes at the beginning you have a very, very good idea, but when it comes to writing, the effect is not that good. Then you have to accept to abandon it and do something else. And I think that if you are a writer, you have to accept to throw away a lot of things, and you should not be too narcissistic, and you should not be too susceptible in French. I mean, you should not be angry when someone tells you it's not good. You know, my publisher, he tells me sometimes, no, that's not working, that's not good. And I say, okay, I redo it. That's our job, to redo and redo and redo again. There is no, it doesn't happen like this. It's a lot of work.
Can I just say I'm very grateful for that question, because as I was coming onto the stage, my wife said, don't forget to mention your new novel, which is called Live a Little. And I've had no opportunity to mention my new novel, which is called Live a Little. But now I do, because yes, I wrote a novel called Live a Little, which I then abandoned. And then I abandoned it because I thought I had to write a novel about Donald Trump, because Donald Trump. And I wrote a novel about Donald Trump called Pussy, and and my publisher said, see if you can get an opportunity to mention Pussy, so I mentioned Pussy as well. And then when I finished Pussy, which I mentioned very quickly because there's not an awful lot to say about Donald Trump. How do you write about the most stupid man who's ever lived and need more than 1 page to write the story? So I wrote Pussy and took a few more pages. The dedication page took something, and a few acknowledgements and thank yous. And then I came back to Live a Little. And it's, when you've written a book about somebody who's as stupid as that, it's a great relief to return to a novel. It's called Live a Little, about some intelligent, charming, and wise people. So thank you.
Who's next? What about you, ma'am? Yes, in the second row.
Hi, good evening. I'm Simrit, and my question is to all of you. Is it necessary or mandatory to go through that gamut of emotions of depression, heartbreak, and pain that makes you a better writer?
Do depression, heartbreak, and pain make you a better writer?
I think they make you a better human. Definitely. I mean, I think they're like essential to the human experience to some degree. And I think, yeah, I do think they're important for writing. But I don't think writing has to be sad. Although I think writing does involve suffering. But I don't know. I think the sadness and I think the happiness and all strong emotions that you feel and experience, they just carve you out as a person a little more finely. And I think that all feeds into the work as well.
To be really honest, I think that nothing is mandatory when it comes to writing. What I love about writing is do whatever you want. Nothing is necessary, mandatory. You do whatever you want. You use whatever you can use. If you're a very funny person, use it. If you're depressed, alcoholic, drug addict, crazy, very nice, very bad, whatever, use what you are and use what you have. You don't have to be something. You just have to express who you are. I think. So nothing is necessary. Be free.
And you don't have to seek out suffering. That's the lovely thing about the human experience. Suffering knows where you live. It knows your home address, and when it's your turn, you'll get a knock on the door and your suffering will begin, right? So you don't have to actually go look for it. It's coming for you eventually.
Someone at the back? Yes, how about you? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, well, you can be next. Yes, let's go to that girl there. Yes, you just stood up.
Good evening, I'm Niharika. As a person to become writer myself, sometimes I write plots and I found a glimpse of my life in that. What's your take on that? I do not affect my character's personality, because as a person I do not want everyone to take a glimpse of my personal life. But when my friends read the story, they said that it's a part of your personal story. The characters do not have their personal life separated from you.
I would like to answer you with a little story. You know, I was in Morocco and I was doing a presentation about my first book, Adele, who is about a sex addict and a woman who has a secret life. And at that time I was married and my husband was in the public and my mother too. And at the end of the presentation, a young girl with a veil, very shy, she came to my mother and she said to my mother, "But do you still love her? Are you angry against her?" And my mother said, "No, of course, not only I love her, but I'm very proud of her because she wrote a book." And I understood that for many people, for instance, in my country, in traditional country where women are not taught to speak up and to say what they want to say, it is very difficult to write because people think that if I write and if I say the truth, or not only the truth, but my truth, people are going to judge me. I'm going to be marginalized. My family is going to be angry against me and my neighbors. And I will say, you don't care. Write whatever you have to write, and to be really honest, if you want to write, you have to be brave. To be brave enough to face that, and it's worth it. And the truth is that when I wrote this book, I felt the vertigo of truth. In real life, we lie all the time, and we have to do as if, and you smile to people that you don't like. When you write, you can revenge, and you can say the truth, and you can, you know, people you don't like, you can write very bad things about them. Use that. Say the truth. Don't be afraid.
One last question. That's all we have time for. And how about you there? Yes. I'm sorry to everyone else.
Hi, I'm Kashish Lewis, and thank you for such a lovely session today. And thanks to you that we now know that fiction can come out of nowhere and anywhere. And also thanks to the shoebox story, we know that it can come out of even a stage that you're talking on. My question is, some of the readers, most of the readers, find to relate when they read. They look to relate to the book that they're reading. So how do you draw that thin line of fiction and reality when you're writing?
It's not the writer's fault if readers read badly. I get very exasperated with the whole vocabulary of relating. You see reviews in which somebody will say, "I couldn't relate to this character." It's not your job to relate to this character. I see reviews that said, "I didn't find anybody likable in this novel." It's not your job to find anybody likable, and it's not the novelist's job to make anybody likable. It's not meant to be, reading is not meant to be a loving. You're not meant to kiss the book or take the book to bed with you and sleep with the book. And if you do take a good book to bed with you and sleep with the book, you will wake up very unhappy with that book in the morning.
Okay, these are such good evenings. Sometimes you find yourself thinking, why can't we do this 365 days of the year? Why can't we all get together? But it'll have to end there. So thank you so much for all of you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to you all.
And thank you, Chandras, for stepping in and doing this for us. Thank you.
Please join me once again in giving a warm round of applause to Elizabeth Gilbert, Leila Slimani, Avni Doshi, and Howard Jacobson, along with Chandrahas Chowdhury, the moderator for this session. This session was brought to you by Dainik Bahaskar. Now, I believe that Avni Doshi and Howard Jacobson have agreed to sign books. So you'll be able to pick up copies of their books at the JCB Prize for Literature bookshop, which is next to Charbagh on the left-hand side. You can pick up their books there, and then please make your way to the Z kiosk, which is back here at the Nexa front lawn. You'll find it in the far right corner. It's all lit up for you at the moment in blue and white. That's the Z kiosk. That is where the author signings will take place. Avni Doshi and Howard Jacobson will be signing books. And if you're still seated, you'll have to be quick. You might want to check if you have a red sticker on the back of your seat. If you do, someone's waving down the back. Congratulations. Will you make your way down here? We have a prize giveaway for you. And for those of you who haven't quite had enough entertainment yet today, we are putting on the Jaipur music stage from 7 o'clock tonight. That's not here, that's at Hotel Clark's Eyre. There are 2 performances happening there this evening. The first is Abha Hanjura, featuring Kashmiri folk ensemble. The genre there is eclectic folk pop with sounds from Kashmir. After them is Parvaz, a progressive Indian rock group that was put on the Rolling Stone India cover and called the most exciting band in India. Please do join us from 7 p.m. Tickets are 500 rupees for the 2 performances back-to-back, and you can buy those tickets on site at Hotel Clark's Eyre this evening. And as you're making your way out, I'll invite you to please check that you have all your belongings with you. Please take your garbage with you. This is a family home. We cherish it, and we do try to keep it clean and tidy. Please take your garbage and put it in the bins provided. We'll be very grateful, as will the family whose home this is, and we really are so grateful to them for opening their home to us every year for the Z Jaipur Literature Festival. I'm going to run through our sponsor list quickly, but there's nothing quick about the sponsor list because there are just so many organizations and companies that have provided sponsorship for the festival, and without them, this simply would not be possible. Z is the title partner. Nexa is the associate partner and venue partner at the front lawn. The Bank of Baroda is the venue partner for Baitak. Motwani Jadeja Foundation is the venue partner for Durbar Hall. Rajasthan Tourism is our tourism partner. The JCB Prize for Literature Festival Bookstore is managed by Full Circle. The Aga Khan Foundation is a series partner. Renkit Bankaiser is our official cause partner. And Diageo is our celebration partner. We have series partners, the North India Office of the US Embassy in New Delhi and Mahindra World City. Session partners are British Council, Netflix, Etsy, Public Health Engineering Department, United Nations India, Avid Learning, Murti Classical Library of India of Harvard University Press, Australian High Commission, the Australia Council for the Arts, Paras Build Tech, Sahitya Academy, Centre for Policy Research. Media partners are Dainik Bahaskar, Rajasthan Patrika, Amar Ujala, Business Standard, Inox, Matrubhumi, Outlook Magazine, The New Indian Express, The Tribune, Red FM as an official radio partner, Lonchora is a podcast partner, Facebook is our community partner, Be Live is our webcast partner, UFO Movies is our cinemedia partner. And further sponsors include Jan Mikalski, Zomato, DLF, Penguin Random House, Jay Shri Periwal International School, Air Asia, Save the Children, Citibank, Storytel, CK Birla Hospital, LIC, Sotheby's, State Bank of India, John L. Bissell Foundation, JW Marriott, Airtel, Karma Kettle, Grover Zampa, Coca-Cola, Kingfisher as a Good Times partner, Gulmohar Lane, Hotel Diggy Palace, Taj Rambagh Palace, Clark's Amir, where the music stage will be held again tonight from 7 o'clock. That's the final music concerts in the series for this year. The Royal Opera House in Mumbai, the Lalits, Full Circle, Pratam Books as an outreach partner, Yuva Ekta Foundation, Royal Treasure, Eventbot, Edelman, Social Connect, McCain, Unibic, Wagbakriti, Maskin, Kanha Sweets, and Be Live. That brings us to the end of day 3 of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival for 2020. If you would like to come early tomorrow morning, we do have a special program early morning here at the Nexa front lawn from 8:45 for 15 minutes tomorrow. We'll be hosting a little mini pranayama session, 8:45 till 9, and that's followed by a classical music concert for 45 minutes, which is always just an exquisite way to start the day and set the tone for the literary sessions to follow. So please do join us at 8:45 for pranayama and 9 a.m. tomorrow here at Nexa Front Lawn for a classical music concert.